Hey everyone, it's Mikki here. You're listening to Wikipedia, and this week on the show, I speak to Professor Ken Ford. Professor Ken Ford is the co-founder and director of the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition, or IHMC. And today on the podcast, Professor Ford and I discuss artificial intelligence, ketogenic diets, why you can't trust nutrition science, how Ken got into his field, and so much more. He is a wealth of information. He is so well read, and he is, of course, the co-host of an amazing podcast, which I listen to all of the time, STEM Talk, which is brought out by IHMC. So I was super interested to chat to Ken because he just seems to have his finger on the pulse in all of the relevant Healthspan and longevity research. So I thought it would be great to sit down and chat to him. And believe you me, this conversation did not disappoint. So Ken Ford is founder and chief executive officer of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, or IHMC. It's a not-for-profit research institute located in Florida. IHMC has grown into one of the nation's, that's the US, premier research organisations with world-class scientists and engineers investigating a broad range of topics related to building technological systems aimed at amplifying and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience. And Ken and I have a really good discussion around how you integrate all of these people from varied backgrounds and how they all come together to sort of solve a problem. It's super fascinating. Ken is the author of hundreds of scientific papers and 6 books. He received his Ph.D. in Computer Science from Tulane University. He is a Fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, a Charter Fellow of the National Academy of Inventors, and a member of the Association for Computing Machinery, the IEEE Computer Society, and the National Association of Scholars. In February of 2012, Dr. Ford was named to the Defence Science Board, and in 2013 he became a member of the Advanced Technology Board, which supports the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. In 2018, Dr. Ford was appointed to the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And in 2020, Florida Trend magazine named Ken Ford one of its living legends, a list of all-time influential Florida leaders in business, medicine, academia, entertainment, politics, and sport, which is super amazing. So I have put links to Ken's bio and also STEM Talk in the show notes for you to peruse after the fact, and you'll listen to Ken talk about some of the most interesting interviews that he has done on STEM Talk, and they are with people that I have also spoken to, which is super cool. Before we crack on into the episode, though, I'd like to remind you that the best way to support this podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favourite podcast listening platform. That increases the visibility of Wikipedia within the sea of thousands of other podcasts that people could be listening to. So that would be amazing. I would appreciate it. All right, team. For now, though, enjoy the conversation that I have with Professor Ken Ford. Too, because I misspeak quite a bit. So Ken, to kick us off, when we were bouncing around topics, and firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me this morning. I really appreciate it because as I understand, you're super busy at the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition with your research and your duties and your podcast. So I really appreciate you taking the time this morning.
Well, I'm happy to do it.
And whilst we were sort of bouncing around topics, you said to me, Mikki, you may want to ask about IHMC because it's rather an unusual place. And I thought that would be a really good place to start, actually. So can you give us a rundown on what happens at IHMC?
Absolutely. So IHMC is a research laboratory. It's a not-for-profit laboratory of the state university system in Florida. So it's not part of any specific university. It's a statewide lab that operates as part of the university system. And IHMC is a highly interdisciplinary lab focusing on three primary research areas. The first and original area for the lab in 1990, when we were formed, is artificial intelligence and related fields. The second large thrust area, about 10 years later, around 2000, we really began building up in robotics, and particularly bipedal robotics and exoskeletons. And the third area, about 10 or 15 years later, was Healthspan resilience and performance, focused on human resilience and performance to a large extent, and of course, Healthspan. So those are the three focus areas. There are about 160 of us here. And as I said, we're across a wide range of disciplines, but we all share a similar goal. That is the application of science and technology to leveraging and extending the human experience and human capabilities, whether that be through a computational means like AI, or through an electromechanical means like robotics, or through a biological means like the Healthspan work.
And how long have you been at IHMC, Ken?
I'm the founder. There was an original group, and that was 1990, and we became a not-for-profit in 2004. Prior to that, we were state employees. We were all professors.
And was it a natural progression to sort of layer those three different focus areas? So did they naturally progress along in terms of the focus of the group? So did it just make sense to extend it to those three areas?
It did and it didn't. So in a traditional academic sense, these areas would not even be in the same, they would not only not be in the same department, they wouldn't probably be in the same university and probably not in the same campus, right? So one group would be in the medical school, one group would be in engineering, and another group would be in computer science or math. But, our academic traditions, it's a lot of hubris to think that we've carved nature at her joints. The real excitement for me in research is often in the boundary spaces between the traditional disciplines. So we aimed at that on purpose and sort of were free of the constraints of history. So we thought that our goal would be to advance the human condition, and particularly human performance, and do it through a variety of means. So at first, like I said, it was computational. And then when we were able to recruit some world-class roboticists, and they shared this human-centered perspective, which is somewhat rare in robotics, we moved into that area. And then moving into Healthspan resilience and performance made sense because it's clearly about advancing the human, but also biology in general now has become a highly computational science. And the sort of hard line between machine learning and computer science and applications in biology is really very blurred now. So it did make sense intellectually, but it might not make sense historically.
Yeah, I find it super interesting because, when you said that a lot of biology is computational, like I think I understand what you're saying, but can you describe that further, actually? Like, is it just that biology is not a mathematical, because when I think computation, I think mathematics and algorithms, and I don't know whether that's the same thing as what you're describing, or is it actually something different?
Well, much cutting-edge biology these days involves the use of equipment that produces so much data that without very sophisticated computational methods, you're both overwhelmed with the data, but also unable to make meaning from it. So if you think of a sequencer, for example, that's doing high-end sequencing, the data produced is incredible. And really, many of the models now in biology are highly computational in nature. And so it made sense in a way. And the nice thing about having real computer scientists and real AI experts in the same place you have people working in biology is that you sort of have top tier people in both areas, rather than seeing the support staff kind of idea about the people doing the computation, their peers. And that makes for interesting collaborations and interesting proposals.
Absolutely. And so what kind of research takes place at IHMC, I guess, to give us some like good description, I suppose, of the things that you're looking at that we might know about? Like, and I think it's just because the whole area of I guess human cognition and machine intelligence is a little bit obviously we're all aware of AI and we use AI, but it still seems a little bit removed from real life, even though, of course, we're integrating a lot more of it in what we do day to day and it's all around us. I think the idea of sort of the connection of the two might still seem a little bit removed.
Sure. There are two primary perspectives on AI at IHMC. The first of these is a rather human-centered view, in which an important goal of AI should be the design and construction of computational devices that essentially extend human cognitive capabilities. So one can think of these as sort of cognitive orthotics or cognitive ortheses. The other area of interest and focus regarding AI at IHMC is really around human-machine teaming, and in particular, the relationship between humans and machines that display some degree of autonomy or some degree of initiative. And this is fascinating because for a long time, we talked about the relationship between humans and machines is essentially the human is the operator of the machine. And so then you would come up with better user interfaces and, more clever ways of interacting with the machine. And this is all good and very important. However, once you have machines that are making decisions typically at a very high rate, and they have a degree of initiative, we've granted them as humans some degree of autonomy or initiative. Now, no one has full autonomy, right? I'm married. I very much know I'm not autonomous. And we would never grant our machines, I hope, more autonomy than I have. But we grant them some autonomy, whether you're in a self-driving car or whether you're involved in a medical device. These things are having to make decisions very rapidly. And so what human-machine teaming is about shifting the relationship from the human as operator to human as teammate. And teammate is a fascinating field. Both human-human teams are very interesting. What makes a successful team? What's the minimum criteria for a teammate? But also very interesting when the teammate is a machine. And that's a big area of research here and other places, but it's one of our focus areas.
I think the idea of that, Ken, is almost I don't know if scares is the right word, but maybe challenges our understanding of natural order in the world. Does that make sense? Because I guess some of the uncertainty around AI is a lot of people talk about AI taking over the world, for example, and not rendering us useless, but changing the things that we do in a way that makes us, I don't know, less important or less relevant or actually less useful in terms of jobs and things like that. So do you get any, do you understand that that premise? Like, is that something you hear a lot or like a fear about AI? Yeah.
Oh, yes, ad nauseum. The way to think of AI, I often tell people when you're worried about AI, especially modern AI, the current sort of AI that's in the news a lot, almost all of it is statistical in nature. It's using sophisticated methods, yes, and deep neural nets, but the underlying mathematics is essentially statistical and probabilistic. And of course, there's some logic, but because it runs on a computer, but it's essentially probabilistic. And substitute for the word AI in the sentence, AI will take over the world, then substitute the word statistics and see if it's still frightening. Am I afraid of AI? No, but I'm very afraid of what humans might do with it. So the thing that worries me isn't mathematics. Mathematics is neutral with respect to what humans might do with it. But I am, of course, quite concerned about what people do. And that is a legitimate worry.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think that's probably where the fear comes from, isn't it? It's exactly what you've just described.
Yeah. If that doesn't worry people, they're not paying attention.
Ken, when was your career, was there a pivotal moment in your career that influenced the path towards looking at both human cognition and machine intelligence?
Yes. By the way, that's a great question. My original academic interest was in philosophy, especially philosophy of the mind. In short, I was really interested in how can an organ, like a brain or a liver, any organ, how might an organ ever give rise to something like a mind? While I was in the Navy, I was introduced to computers. By the way, very much against my will, but they didn't actually ask me what I wanted to do. And I was also became sort of a computer hobbyist, building very early microprocessor-based systems, before there were commercial home computers to play with. It dawned on me during that time period that the computer was not only a wonderful new tool that we could use for useful things, but it also was at a certain level of abstraction analogous to and explanatory of the mind-brain relationship. And that was what I was always interested in, the mind-brain relationship. That is, a program running on a computer is much like a mind running on a brain. It depends entirely, in both cases, on a specific and necessary physical substrate, but it's not reducible to that substrate. I was intrigued, and the more I studied computers, I started to think about intelligent machines. I started to think about the new field at the time of artificial intelligence. And although philosophy had provided me a wonderful perspective and background for thinking about thinking, essentially, methodologically and conceptually, maybe I'm unfair, but as a young person there, I felt that the shelves were kind of bare. In other words, I didn't see how the tools of philosophy, I could really make a contribution to this problem. And so I decided to pursue a Ph.D. in computer science instead of philosophy and to study AI. And that's really how I segued from philosophy to AI.
And have you always been interested in the human element and human resilience and this third tier of our IHMC that's now doing, a ton of research in the anti-aging? Maybe you always have, but have you always been interested in that health aspect?
Partly. What my original interest in these kinds of topics was as an athlete. So I was a serious wrestler, and it's an intense sport. I was very interested in performance and things related to performance. And then as I matured, grew older, had different careers, I continued to have that interest. And at some point, the issues of resilience and a more resilient human, more resilient society started to occupy my thinking. And at some point, it struck me that really the goals for that work was really philosophically aligned with the other work at IHMC. It's just the methods were very different. And I thought that this would be a good time to move in that direction. It seems to me that Healthspan is such a critical issue, and it just made sense that we would move in that direction.
Yeah. And, what kinds of questions are you studying at IHMC that encompass it?
Well, we don't say we're studying anti-aging, of course, because the only way not to age is to be deceased. We don't talk much about longevity either, though I do think it would be probably a positive side effect of Healthspan. So we're really focused on Healthspan issues and not particular diseases usually. So in medicine in general, at least in the United States, I think there too, we take sort of a whack-a-mole approach. It's a very disease-oriented approach. And we're trying to avoid that. I mean, if it's a real particular instance where we have some deep, relevant expertise about a specific disease or a particular effect of a disease, maybe we would or do sometimes. But usually it's about Healthspan. And coming back to disease for a minute, we all realize the number one risk factor for almost everything is aging. And it's not the age on your calendar. As I said, there's nothing we can do about that. It's about the condition, your health span. And that's really what drives literally almost every disease. Is the primary risk factor is age, much more than smoking, much more than any other big risk factor. It's age. And it's not about the driver there isn't, you're, like I said, how many years old you are. It's what kind of condition you're in. How old is your biology, not how old is your chronology. So we became very interested in that. We do a lot of research for the military and for NASA, where we're trying to optimize the performance of elite performers and how to extend their period of high performance. It's one thing, for most of these folks, they're already very high performers. They typically aren't, their problem isn't adding a tiny increment of performance, especially the military and the NASA folks. They're really interested in continuing to perform at a high level. How can they stretch that period of high performance?
Yeah, super interesting. And, across the years, Ken, has your opinion changed as to what's possible in this field, and I guess in the Healthspan space as well? Do you think are you ahead of where you thought we would be in 2024, or well behind?
Well, in AI, we're far ahead of where I thought we would be in some areas, particularly statistically driven approaches like large language models and deep learning. We're far ahead in pattern recognition. We're ahead in statistical methods of natural language processing. All of those were far ahead of where I would have guessed even 20 years ago. I just didn't think it would advance at the rate it has. But we're far behind in areas that I thought we would have made progress. And, when I think about it, many of the research areas that I found most interesting and most important have kind of disappeared. And it's not because anybody solved them. It's because we just ignore them now. And I think that's quite unfortunate. So a lot of the classical research challenges in AI, I think they've basically stopped because some current approaches like large language models have really sucked the air out of the room, so to speak. And, when you're talking about a classic hard problem that we haven't solved, nobody wants to hear it in an era of hype and overconfidence in the methods that the media and the people are aware of. So that's it's sort of a mixed Mikki. It's we're ahead and behind. So there you go.
Yeah, and do you think the areas that are being ignored now because they don't seem to be important challenges at this time, is that going to be detrimental to the field in the long run?
I think so, for sure. Much of this is driven by the funding agencies. Scientists have ideas, and they have ideas about what would be a hard and important problem to work on. But science is very expensive, and if nobody's willing to fund it, it doesn't happen. And so really core areas are underattended to that used to be right at the heart. And their importance hasn't diminished. They're just sort of ignored.
Yeah. Do you have an example, Ken, that you can share with us?
So, for example, AI approaches to knowledge representation, reasoning, explanation, deep language understanding, planning, automated planners. We still build these things for particular applications, but the focus, the research focus, the money, and the attention is all going into sort of a very narrow band of technological approaches to AI, and the rest are sort of underattended to.
Mm. And it's interesting because you mentioned where a lot of the hype and the money is going, and the things that are being ignored seem almost fundamental to those big things, Ken.
They really are. And I wish I had a good analogy for you. You could imagine a similar kind of thing could happen in other fields where there's so much excitement and sort of hype about something that the public can wrap their head around. They can go on the internet and have a conversation with ChatGPT or some other chatbot and not realize that how the system they're interacting with works, and not understand that it's not understanding in any real sense anything they're typing.
I do know. I think this is an analogy which probably won't fit, but I think of lab-based meat in nutrition and the hype around that, and that this is going to solve some sort of climate problem that we have because we're all eating meat.
Yeah, the flatulent cows.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably it's not a perfect analogy by any stretch of the imagination, but we get very excited by these new things that are supposed to solve a problem that aren't really a problem.
Right. As a culture, we often spend great effort and disrupt society significantly to solve a problem that's not a problem.
Yeah.
And that's probably a function of such a padded world. We live in an environment where people act as if reality is optional. It's you just have to support the proper narrative, but reality has a way of coming around, and you only get to ignore it so long.
Yeah, for sure. Ken, an area which I've seen you've published research on, and you talk a bit in, obviously in STEM Talk, which is your podcast, is on the use of ketones, and that's something which I'm super interested in from both a health and performance perspective. Can you chat to me a little bit about your perspective on how they're studied, I guess? Yeah, so first and foremost, let's start there.
Sure. So yes, we are very interested in ketones, and in the lab, we're particularly interested in exogenous ketones, though, ketone bodies produced via the diet are fascinating, and still so much more is being learned constantly about their function. But when we do research related to ketones, because it's of importance to our customer, we're focused mostly on exogenous ketones. And we think there's great potential there, both in health and disease. And, the role of ketone bodies as a mobile and really highly efficient energy source has long been appreciated. Richard Veitch and people before him even really pioneered this area. But in recent years, we've seen that many of the most exciting efforts of ketones are not arising from their energetic properties, which is what everyone thinks of, right? When you think of ketones, you think of it accurately as a highly efficient energy source. But a lot of the most exciting research now is looking at ketone bodies as signaling agents. It's the signaling functions of the circulating ketones themselves that are very, very interesting. So they're complex, and they have many more functions and many more effects than were known even 5 or 10 years ago. They regulate inflammation to a high degree. They regulate and affect gene expression. Well, when you affect gene expression and inflammation, that's serious implications for both health span and longevity. Many of today's chronic diseases are really about a dysregulated metabolism. The people estimate as many as 90% of people in the Western world basically have dysregulated metabolism. And so we're very interested in this. And exogenous ketones, both therapeutic uses, but also prevention, treatment, or management of patients with neurologic disorders, and a wide range of other issues. We look at traumatic brain injury, for example, and can you lessen the damage done when the blow is struck if the person has very elevated levels of circulating ketones. Ketones are anti-catabolic, and we're interested in sarcopenia here. And, when you think of maintenance of muscle mass as one goes into the later years is absolutely critical and underattended to. And you sort of have a seesaw. On one end of the seesaw is anabolism, and other end of the seesaw is catabolism. And so if you have an anti-catabolic effect, that's very nice. It's beneficial for the seesaw, just as having an anabolic effect would be. And that's of great interest. But, it's a topic where a lot more research is needed. We do a lot of research related to military applications, mostly having to do with things like traumatic brain injury, the ability to function in high altitudes, and does it affect cognition? Does it affect fitness? So we've been looking at people that need to conduct activities in the mountains, for example, and make quick, accurate decisions. Because we know our thinking is degraded with hypoxia. So we look at ketones in the context of hypoxia as well.
Ken, is there a difference between ketone bodies that we produce ourselves and the exogenous ketones?
Well, that's interesting. And, there are some differences. I think where you're really going with that, and it's something that doesn't get talked about enough, are there physiologic differences? When you look at all the things that our endogenous, our self-produced ketones do in our body, is there some function that seems quite different for the exogenous ketones? And the one that usually, especially by marketing people that are selling ketone salts typically, not esters normally it would be the salt folks, but they talk about, drink this drink and then you'll be a fat burning machine. You hear things like that. Well, no, just the opposite. If you're in ketosis, nutritional ketosis, yes, you're very effectively metabolizing fat. And so if leanness and weight loss is an issue for this person, the ketogenic diet is often a very good approach. Once you drink the exogenous ketones, lipolysis, that is basically breaking down fat for metabolism, that actually stops. You have a feedback system there, and you've just interrupted it and sent it the signal you don't need to do that. So the main difference is the effect on lipolysis. So you have many benefits from exogenous ketones, but one of them isn't weight loss because of metabolism. The reason people lose weight when they drink exogenous ketones is it often suppresses their appetite. But it's not like the ads you see about being a fat-burning machine or something.
Yeah. And similarly, I would say that about keto gummies, and I'm not sure if you've seen them, Ken. Yeah, I have people
Even
close to me have spent hundreds of dollars on these things, and I'm like, okay. Is there sex differences, Ken, between in our ability to produce ketones? I don't know if I've ever seen anything actually on that. I'm just curious as to if you know anything.
Not definitively. There really hasn't been the kind of study you think would have been done. So we observe, in studies, not studies with the goal of understanding sex differences, but just studies that have both males and females in them. We see that, yes, both produce substantial ketones, but anecdotally, many people have said that they think it's different, and they both produce ketones, but perhaps at a different level. And but I just don't know. There's a lot of confounding variables there. You would have to do this study in a very controlled environment, in a metabolic ward. It would be hard to do with a free living population. Any variance will make a big difference. So if somebody just says, well, I'll just have 3 crackers,
Yeah.
You really have to have them in an environment where you controlled entirely what people consumed. And it would be very expensive.
Yeah. I can imagine that kind of metabolic ward study. The person that springs to mind is who's done studies not related to sex, but metabolic ward. Kevin Hall does a lot of that type of research, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. And super interesting questions and findings from his research. Can I remember seeing that you co-authored a response to a paper by Mikki and colleagues that dismissed the use of ketones as an ergogenic aid, which was in a study done in time trialing cyclists. And I'll obviously put links in the show notes so people can sort of see what I'm referring to. But you cited that there were several errors in the methodology they used that would have contributed to their negative findings. And I've seen this as well in research done by Burke and colleagues in race walkers, and disproving, if you like, the utility of a ketogenic diet, not ketones per se. Do you have any sort of thoughts on the way that research is conducted in this area? Have some of these issues been resolved in more recent trials?
Well, First of all, that group seems to have a passion to focus negative outcomes on anything with the word ketone in it. I'm not sure why that is, but it's been well observed. Let's put it that way. But let's focus on the paper you mentioned. So as you said, we did note several shortcomings. The first one that just jumps out at you when you read the paper is rather than use the well-tested and tolerated beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester, they used an acetoacetate diester. And that was shocking, right? So, all of the work that you read about ketone esters and cyclists and use in the Tour de France and all of this, these are beta-hydroxybutyrate monoesters. So this was very surprising to me that you would use that. And at first I was quite cross about that. And I asked people if they knew why that was chosen. And it turns out it's a relatively innocent answer. They had originally intended actually to use the beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester in their study, but unexpectedly and suddenly it was made unavailable to them, and they had already arranged for a professional cycling team to come and be part of the study. So that put them in an awkward spot. Now, using the acetoacetate diester, I wouldn't have done that. I probably would have rescheduled. But at least it explains the first thing. When you read the paper, you go, whoa, why did they do that? And it's thought that to have any sort of ergogenic effects from the ingestion of a ketone ester, you'd have to get blood concentrations above 2 millimolars. And it's very unlikely they reached that level using the ester they used. But in any case, they don't know what the blood level was. So in a scientific paper about whether ketones have an ergogenic effect, you would want to know what the blood level was. But they didn't look. They used urine strips. And urine strips don't correlate with blood ketone levels after one ingests exogenous ketones. So it's kind of a mess. And then all of this aside, the probable cause of the performance impairment that they said they saw, and they admit this in the paper, was the frequency and the severity of GI distress experienced by the athletes, assuming the acetoacetate diester. Well, if you're in a time trial and you have diarrhea and other problems like this is not performance enhancing. Yeah. So, everyone knows that the diester is quite unpalatable and it's known for strong GI effects. So that was sort of my take on it. And you also asked, you already hinted at whether I thought the sort of study was set up to fail. And really, I can't speak to that. Who knows what the motives were. But, I'm willing to just think it was the logistical difficulty I mentioned originally, right? The ester they wanted to use was unavailable. And frankly, the inexperience in doing ketone ester studies. You wouldn't do a ketone ester study and not know the blood levels. So I kind of just put that I just set that aside. But I wanted to loop back to something. There's so much focus, I think partly because of cyclists using it in things like the Tour and all the controversies. Really, there's too much focus, I think, on the potential performance enhancing aspects of exogenous ketones. Research is strongly showing that post-exercise ketone supplementation really improves exercise recovery and promotes beneficial training adaptations to muscle and other tissue. Well, I think this is actually more exciting. And so hence for athletes and others engaged in really vigorous exercise, the greater benefit could well be by enhancing post-exercise recovery instead of somehow acutely improving performance.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful, and I agree with what I've seen in the research, and I've spoken to Professor Brendan Egan on, and I know of course you have as well, on his research.
Yes, he did his sabbatical here.
Yeah, that's right, he did. I remember we chatted about that. Mm-hmm. And, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you would think that some of the very like what you described, Ken, as issues with this research seem almost 101 with regards to research in the area of ketones. And and of course, if they were inexperienced, the researchers, and then they wrote up their study for it to be published, you'd think that this would have been picked up in the peer-reviewed process.
Yes. Peer review is really a mess these days. And, I don't know about the case of that paper, but yes, it should have been picked up in peer review. But it is problematic. We talked earlier about how heavily and how important computation is now in these kinds of topics. So often you'll get a paper to peer review and it has an incredible amount of data, which are often not given, and complicated computer models, which are obscure to you. And they're using machine learning methods that you can't really see under the hood how it's working. So I'm not really talking about this paper, but in general, peer review is becoming more and more difficult and less reliable, in my view.
Yeah, and you did mention in our conversation when we were chatting about this, the work of John Ioannidis. Is that how I say his name? And I've heard his name.
Ioannidis.
Yes.
Yeah, Ioannidis. He's a very bright fellow, and he's written some of the most cited papers in science history, particularly the paper about, it annoyed a lot of people, but the paper was essentially titled something like "Most Scientific Findings Are False." That's especially true in medicine. That's not true. So when people talk about science, they're often talking about science through the lens of their career and where they work. So if you work in a medical school, then you think of science in those terms, and so he does, right? He's really talking about medical science. Most findings in other sciences are not false. Computer science are not false, or engineering are not false. This is really a big problem in sciences that essentially use statistical methods. I think it's part of the problem. But you would think that when a very skilled and prominent researcher goes through the literature and shows that most, not many, most of the findings in that part of science are false, you think that would change the behavior. Journal editors would behave differently, reviewers would behave differently, funding agencies would behave differently. Other than annoying people and pointing out the problem, it really didn't change a thing, which is quite disappointing. And he did the same thing with COVID. Early on in COVID, he went through the numbers and said the fatality rate the government is talking about cannot be true, right? It has to be a tiny fatality rate. Mm-hmm. And again, what happened was he was censored and bullied and threatened, but nothing changed. So he's a sad case in a way. He's a brilliant guy, and he's doing what he thinks is the right thing, but it never gets really discussed because, who really wants to know that the emperor has no clothes? So, maybe it doesn't look good with no clothes. Put your clothes on, dude. I think Ioannidis is fabulous myself.
Yeah. And, when you mentioned him, because I've heard his, as I said, several times, not just on STEM Talk, but in other podcasts, and I just can't help but think of nutrition science as well. And maybe you were meaning to include that in, he was talking about medicine, but nutrition science seems rife with this issue.
I think the single shabbiest, I'm not sure I would even call it science, but the single shabbiest area of research I've ever come across is nutrition. It's in a class by itself, and it's highly political and ideological. It's almost like religion. It's incredible. It's sort of, like I said, I would say nutrition is the shabbiest, followed maybe by epidemiology. Not all epidemiology, but some people combine the two, and then that's always really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And, it really makes me, and I understand why people would feel this way, like question almost everything that you might read in these fields as, how can you put any faith into what's coming out of journals and things these days? Like, how do you, Ken, sort of, do you not?
I don't take it at blind faith. And as a consequence, it's time consuming. And you end up having to really study the article at a level that shouldn't be necessary. And as I said, peer review is in a in a bad spot. And partly it's the pressure to publish or perish for academics. So we have literally thousands of journals, and they're very profitable. And everyone pops a new journal up. I mean, there are many times more journals now than there was when I was a young professor. Many, many times more. And so we have a proliferation of journals and a proliferation of papers being submitted to the journals, and they're harder to review. And it is an issue. One of the ways I'm often loath to admit it, but a lot of it has to do with knowing the integrity of the author or of the research group it came from. So if I know this person is doing real research, he or she will let the results fall where they fall. In other words, they're not driven by their personal agenda or some other agenda that somebody else has. I tend to have more confidence in their findings than a random researcher or results from a research group that I know are historically flawed. And it doesn't correlate with how famous the institution is at all. Some of the most dreadful stuff comes out of very famous places.
Oh, it absolutely does. And then I've seen so much dreadful nutrition recommendations come out of Harvard.
Yeah.
And people can't even believe it. They're like, but it's an Ivy League school. Like, Harvard's amazing. And I'm like, you just have to read some of their blogs and you just see the slant is just completely
it is. It's money-based is what it really is. As early as the 1960s, the sugar industry funded the research at Harvard that said that sugar wasn't a problem, that the problem was fat. And that was all paid for. He who writes the check calls the tune, and that was paid for by the sugar industry. And that came out not until 2016. So that happened in the 1960s. In 2016, there was a big article in JAMA, Internal Medicine, that sort of revealed that. But when you look at the funding sources of the Department of Nutrition, for example, pretty much everything that you see in the grocery store that you should not buy and you should not eat is a funding source.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And if I circle back, Ken, like you mentioned several minutes ago around the research for ketones in traumatic brain injury. And this is actually related to the topic we were just chatting about, but I thought it was it's an interesting thing. So on the basis of your research and other research in the field, is taking exogenous ketones for traumatic brain injury, is that a therapy that's helpful?
We don't know yet. There are mechanistic reasons to think it might be, and we're in the midst of a large research project that should shed light on that. We're looking at students who are going through Army basic jump school, parachute school, and they run 15,000 people through the school a year. These are unskilled young people. These are not advanced warfighters. These are people sort of right out of high school, typically. Most of them not in tremendous physical condition. And there are about maybe 25, we don't know the exact number yet, but we will. But it's like 25 or 30% receive a brain injury. And these are typically mild traumatic brain injuries. And so we're trying to understand what predisposes some people to the brain injury and not others. And that's a complicated thing. And we're making good progress on that, looking at biomarkers and a wide range of other characteristics of one person as compared to another. But we're also looking at half the cohort. So we have a cohort of around 400 people, and half of the cohort is given a strong ketone ester before the brain impact happens. So we should know whether this reveals a beneficial effect, because we'll know the blood condition, the biomarkers, all their various physical states before and after, and half will have been given the ketone ester. So we don't know yet. It's still blinded to us. If you do these unblinded, if you have any bias, it can creep into it. So we're still blinded. We do see that that we expect to find some interesting things with respect to predictive biomarkers. But the big question that you asked really was about the efficacy of ketone esters for brain injury. It obviously doesn't stop the blow, the insult. The idea is that it ought to, given some mechanistic reasons, reduce the subsequent damage to the brain, which happens after, down the road with inflammation and swelling and lots of other issues.
And I was reading a paper, actually, which made me think of it, around sort of nutritional guidance post-traumatic brain injury, which is different from the study that you're just describing that you have going on. But one of the challenges that people discuss is that the brain can't metabolize glucose in the same way after traumatic brain injury. Have I got that correct?
You absolutely do. And it's also true for people with many neurologic disorders. So Alzheimer's and other neurologic disorders often impair the brain's ability to metabolize glucose. So the person then is experiencing a kind of a brownout, you could think of it. And the ability to metabolize ketones is unchanged. And so that's the thought there. It also reduces inflammation and increases blood flow to the brain. And there's a guy in Canada, Dr. Stephen Cunnane. We interviewed him on STEM Talk, but I can't remember which episode. And Cunnane is doing work trying to understand what level of ketone is needed in the brain to replace the energy lost from the deranged glucose metabolism. It's thought to be relatively high. You would need quite a strong ketone level. But that's very interesting work.
Yeah, and I have listened to that interview of Stephen in your podcast, and I chatted to him as well on my podcast and found it super interesting. What I found interesting in this paper, Ken, because I thought, I was expecting to read some of the guidelines to be around even the possibility that ketones could be an option post-traumatic brain injury. And I know that that's not based on, we don't have any sort of scientific, or I don't think we have a lot of scientific data to necessarily show that, but I just thought the change in brain energy. In this paper, however, they suggested instead to do a carbo load, in fact, around 500 grams of carbohydrate, I believe, to help increase the ability for the brain to use glucose. And I thought that was a super interesting recommendation. So I went to check what references they used because they had referenced it. And one was almost like a round table of nutritionists that had met to discuss strategies for traumatic brain injury. So it wasn't actually a trial. As such, it was just, they referenced this event had occurred. And another one was looking not, in fact, at carbohydrate requirements, but just calorie requirements and energy requirements. So just suggesting that low energy availability would be more detrimental for someone with a TBI. So, ensure that calories are sufficient. Yet this paper referenced it in terms of that we needed to really ramp up the carbohydrate. So it was just such a good example to me of how people use research in a way that's really disingenuous, I think.
Right. They have an agenda. Most people that have had a mild traumatic brain injury are not suffering from a lack of carbohydrates in our culture. And given that the ability to metabolize glucose in the brain is damaged in these people, giving more glucose seems a rather brute force approach.
That's what I thought as well. It's super interesting. Ken, I'm really mindful of your time, and I did want to, if it's all right for you, to just ask you a little bit about what you do for your health and your Healthspan, because everyone's super interesting to understand more about people who work in the field and how their research might I imagine, change what you do on a day-to-day basis. So is it all right if we go there?
Sure, let's do it.
Ken, do you have a morning routine that helps with your creativity or that helps with your sort of day-to-day goings on?
I do. It's nothing particularly amazing. I'm a morning person, and if I have difficult intellectual work to do, I try to do that in the morning. You know, I get up early. I'm an early riser. I'm not a night owl, so I turn in early. As Ben Franklin was fond of saying, early to bed and early to rise makes men healthy, wealthy, and wise. Of course, this bit of wisdom was not originally due to Ben Franklin, but he said it so nicely. You know, I have this thing I call drunch. You know how people have brunch, but I don't know,
Yes.
I can't get into brunch. But drunch, now that is a good time. So I typically have only 1 or 2 meals a day. I eat a lot
Mhm.
of protein, and my last meal usually starts at the latest around 4, unless I have, I'm a social person, so if I have an obligation or friends, sure, I'm flexible, but I
Yeah.
prefer something like drunch, which is obviously a contraction of dinner and lunch. I prioritize sleep. I don't sleep perfectly, but I try, and I do prioritize it. I eat a low carb diet. I have my whole life pretty much since the 60s, the late 60s. And I had a few periods of time when I went off it, and it wasn't good.
Mm.
I typically exercise first thing in the morning in a fasted state
Mhm.
before I eat breakfast. And but if I'm doing heavy resistance training, I do really enjoy a breakfast after I train. And we all do what we like most. So I have friends that just loathe resistance training, and they like other forms. I'm more of a resistance training guy. So how I my favorite way for doing endurance conditioning or aerobic work is in the mountains of Wyoming. I like Wyoming very much and have a house there, and it's at high altitude and it's very steep where the house is. So I find that a lot more fun than sort of camping out on a treadmill or an elliptical machine. And it's very different than sea level. I'm half the time here in Florida, or more than 60%, I'd say. And at sea level, you walk forever and you're not huffing and puffing. But in Wyoming, going up some of those hills, it definitely gets your attention.
Oh, I can imagine. I've not been to Wyoming, but I imagine that it's beautiful. Ken, you mentioned that you've been low carb since the 60s. What do you remember? What sort of got you on that path back then?
Yes, I managed to fall off a porch and hit my head when we lived in Eleuthera, and there were no physicians, and this wasn't a good thing. And so I had seizures and was on phenobarbital, which
Mm.
incapacitates you cognitively. And how I basically was able to get off the drug was a very strict keto diet. And, they don't know what happens. The brain recovers from a brain injury, and they don't know whether I mean, the word the physician used way back then was, well, he might outgrow it, whatever that means. But it quit happening. But I didn't really have a choice. It was either phenobarbital or a very unpleasant version of the diet. It's back when the keto diet was like, it was at Johns Hopkins. They're real pioneers in epileptic approaches for children. And they had this formula that was truly awful. It was like 90% unpalatable fats. And it was like this slimy drink, that you would make in a blender. And nowadays, of course, we know you can have a lot more protein than they thought back then. The thinking then was that any protein at all pretty much would knock you right out of ketosis. And I just ignored those rules once I was on my own in high school. I didn't eat what the other kids ate, and I was a wrestler, so I had to eat a lot of protein. And I realized I would still be in ketosis eating cans of tuna fish and not the stuff they serve in the cafeteria, but they provided me with lots of protein. So I've been doing it a very long time. When I was at NASA for a period, I was stressed, and staff was bringing me food, and of course they didn't bring me anything healthy, right? And so that took me out of ketosis for a couple years, and the results weren't good, and so I went back.
And essentially that's and remained ever since.
Yes, it's a permanent way of life for me. I don't think of it as a diet. I think it is a way of eating, a way of living. And, now that I'm older, I don't have to be as strict as when I was a child, concerned about having seizures. I haven't had a seizure in 50 years or more. And so, now I'm more flexible, but I try to stay in some degree of ketosis all the time. But it's not like a crisis for me. If I'm in Italy and have a couple bites of someone's pasta, I'm not having a nervous breakdown.
Yeah, that's amazing. Ken, what about supplements for you? Are there any that you take?
Yes, I take a lot of them, and I think I should probably just mention a couple. There's two that pretty much everyone should be tested or at least consider. I mean, vitamin D. Vitamin D is it's so important, and such a large percentage of the population is frankly deficient. They're not just not optimal; they're deficient. So I would say vitamin D is a biggie. I'll get to my quirky ones in a minute. And I think creatine, that should almost be in the water supply, though. I don't really mean that, but it does so much good both for muscle and brain. But back to vitamin D, the published levels, when you get a blood draw and you see what the normal range is, yeah, that's normal. Homer Simpson is normal. I think you should be on the very upper end of that range, or maybe even over, in respect to vitamin D, over the quote normal range. It's very insulting to be called normal. But I think what your listeners may find more interesting are more the sort of less common ones. So one I take, and the effects are not obvious, and it's hard. There's so many things that unless you do a real, very controlled study, you really don't know what benefits you're getting. But I take specialized pro-resolving mediators, SPMs, and these really are aimed at helping sort of orchestrate the resolution of inflammation in a wide range of tissues, particularly joints and muscles. And as you know, SPMs are metabolites of omega-3 fatty acids. And as I mentioned, they're thought to play a really critical role in resolution of injury, resolution of inflammation. They're probably what accounts for omega-3 fatty acids' beneficial effects in that area. Not all the effects, but in that area. Now, I use Metagenic's product called SPM Active, and that's a good one. And, that's probably enough about it. I'm going to do a deep dive soon on STEM Talk with a leading SPM researcher. Now that we've bashed Harvard, he's not a nutritionist, so he gets a pass, right? It's Dr. Charles Sirhan, right? And he's really the guru of SPM research. And I think it'll be a very interesting episode. I also take urolithin A in the form of a product called MitoPure. And it's a very interesting compound. It's generated by our own gut microflora. And it's another metabolite. And it's a metabolite of a class of compounds found in pomegranate and, frankly, other fruits and nuts. But pomegranate is the heavy hitter there. But from the diet, first of all, a large number of people can't do the conversion. So the metabolite's not produced from the food they eat. And those that do produce it often produce it at a very low level. Urolithin A, what does it do? Why do I care about it? Well, it's a potent activator of mitophagy. And that's really the selective degradation of mitochondria. This is getting rid of mitochondria that you'd like to see go via autophagy. And much of the research that's really been done on urolithin A has been done in the context of the beneficial effects on muscle. But its effects are much broader than that. In episode 118 of STEM Talk, we did a deep dive with Dr. Julie Anderson, and she's at the Buck Institute, and she does research on urolithin A, and her interest is really the prevention and treatment of neurodegenerative diseases. So I thought, you might find that interesting. And the final one I'll mention is spermidine, and I use the product from Longevity Labs. It's where most of the researchers that have been involved in the research in spermidine are involved with that company, and so I have a high degree of confidence in the product. As you probably know, it's a polyamine compound found in living tissues, all living tissues, plants, everything. And it has a lot of various metabolic functions, but it was originally isolated from semen. And that's why it has the name spermidine. And it's considered a longevity agent in mammals in particular. And there's lots of mechanisms of action that are just beginning to be understood. This one is a little less clear. And as I mentioned, autophagy is the main mechanism at the molecular level, but they're finding evidence for other mechanisms. It connects to lipid metabolism and inflammation and cell growth and death. So it's an interesting compound to keep an eye on. But, I keep tuned into the literature, and I'm absolutely willing to change my mind on things. And there are many others that I take. I just thought this might be interesting because these are ones that maybe some people weren't aware of.
I agree, Ken. Like I was expecting you to say that you'd be taking NAD or resveratrol, and you may well be actually, and the ones that we most commonly hear about.
No, I don't.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
Because the ketogenic diet increases the NAD pool. So one way would be to take NAD, and there's all kinds of or a precursor to NAD, like NMN or NR. And there's a good bit of controversy and unresolved science there. But one way to do it is decrease the use of NAD during the Krebs cycle. And so you have more in the NAD pool. But I do track that. I currently don't take resveratrol or NMN. But again, I'm watching the research and I'm open-minded about these things.
Are you hedging your bets on the other ones, or do you notice? Did you say that you're not necessarily noticing day to day that you're taking them, but at that cellular level,
yes,
they're doing good?
Yes, I anticipate they are, and for a lot of these things, it's really a risk-reward ratio calculation. So there are lots of things you can understand a mechanism and how it might be beneficial. But there's a sufficient risk associated with it that if it might be beneficial, but there's this risk, it usually fails the risk-reward ratio test, where these items I just mentioned thus far pass the risk-reward ratio test for me, at least. It's different for everyone. Another one I like is magnesium L-threonate, a particular form of magnesium.
Yeah. No, I love magnesium as well. And it's the spermidine I've definitely come across. And more actually, I'm hearing people talk about urolithic A. So I find that
yes, that's interesting.
Yeah. Ken, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. And I will just ask one last question. And it is, you've talked to so many people on STEM Talk in there, in such a wide array of areas, which are, of course, related to your area of research. Does any one particular or a couple of interviews sort of stick out in your mind as being most memorable for whatever reason?
Wow. Every interview includes, to me, some surprises. There's one or two that stuck out negatively, which I won't mention. Frequent listeners could probably guess. But in general, literally all but one, I found very interesting myself. And they all contain surprises, either about the person's life and how their life developed and how they ended up in the position they're in. And a lot of our listeners on STEM Talk are graduate students who have a very large postdoc and graduate student population of listeners. And I think they particularly like hearing the sort of life path of this person that they're hearing about. And we have a lot of physician listeners, and it's a way for them to sort of very, very busy people, they get 8 minutes or something, or 10 minutes with each patient, or 15 minutes. And it allows them, when they're going for their morning run or they're commuting, to get boned up on some current science and sort of feed their brains. Those are two big groups of listeners. But, our guests are selected by, and I'm sure you know this, Mikki, they're selected by the Double Secret Selection Committee. And this committee works tirelessly and diligently
Yes.
to identify the most interesting people working in science and tech. And, people try to influence the committee, but it just doesn't work. So, they pick interesting people and lots of surprises. Now, you asked about an exciting upcoming guest. Well, I already gave it away. I'm kind of looking forward to talking to Charles Sirhan. I think his discussions around the pro-resolving mediators, the specialized pro-resolving mediators, will be really interesting to a wide segment of the population. He's a serious scientist, and I think it will be good. And on the sort of more applied front, another person in Boston, Vivian Lowe. She's been on before, and she gave a lecture at IHMC about macrophages. Vivian is very sharp, and she always comes very well prepared, and she's combines a strong understanding of science with clinical experience. So she's always, I think, a good person to chat with.
I love that you mentioned Vivian. I've spoken to her as well, and I especially loved her interview, or your interview with her, talking about her life actually as well, because I found it her background was really fascinating.
It is,
and
she is an amazing person. I mean, her novel, Breaking the Tongue, is superb, and she's an accomplished dancer. She's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would say that the committee that select guests do such an amazing job. You and Dawn both do such a great job of bringing out so much relevant information on the research of the people that you speak to, but also, of course, of that background and that life, because I'm always really interested to understand better the person behind the research as well. So thank you, Ken. Thank you for all the work that you do that allows us to understand better areas of research which seem so sort of abstract, I think, to, well, maybe just to me, but I would say to a lot of people. But you guys do such a great job of making it more translatable.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you, and I enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Alrighty, hopefully you guys enjoyed that conversation, and as I said, I just loved being able to chat to Ken, given he's in my ears several times a month when I go into SEM Talk, listen to their interviews, go back and re-listen to their interviews because they are so scientific yet so fascinating, so I just really love them. Okay, next week on the podcast, I speak to Simone Mayer. She is 5-time winner of Coast to Coast, about her mental tenacity and resilience for being able to give it her all in her sport and in life. For now, though, I'd like to remind you to sign up for the Anatomy of Fat Loss mini course that I have running Sunday 5th of May through to Wednesday 8th of May. It is free, it is being recorded, but make time to be there for at least one of the live sessions because it makes such a difference to your mindset in and around fat loss, and we will be talking about mindset. You can find a link to that also in the show notes or over on my website, mikkywilliden.com. Hit me up on Instagram, Threads and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or Facebook obviously as well at Mikki Williden Nutrition. All right team, have the best week. See you later.